There you go. Trying to hit that post like a radio DJ. Hey, everyone. Hey, friends. Hello, fellow systematic geekologists. I am really excited and super stoked to have John Hendrix join us today to talk about a beautiful book that he created. Telling the story and sharing the story of two of my favorite authors and creators that have ever existed. And so, John, welcome to Systematic Ecology. Glad you can be with us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, yeah. So we are Systematic Ecology. We're a YouTube channel and a podcast that we call ourselves the priest to the geeks. Not all of us are ordained ministers, but we see ourselves as mediators between pop culture and geek culture and the deeper questions that revolve around those things that we geek out on, theological, philosophical questions. And what better two people to talk about like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, who I think were kind of the founders of uh, things like systematic ecology, of gathering together over a pint or a tea and geeking out on myth and story, and then going deeper with it, and even have it inspire their own stories that they tell and their stories of their lives. And so, yeah, that's what John's book is all about. And so, super excited about that. But one thing we do to get started, to kind of get warmed up and to establish some geek cred, is to share what we've been geeking out on lately. And so, John, I'm curious, what have you been geeking out on lately? It could be anything. There's no wrong or right answers. There's no geek shaming. It's just it could be anything. It could be cars. It could be comic books. It could be the latest movie. But what's something you've been geeking out on lately?
You know, really got into Severance. The new season's awesome. And
Mm-hmm.
then I was
Mm-hmm.
sort of surprised because Apple did a tricky thing where they had the season one, episode one of Silo premiere right, or just like play right after the new Severance episode.
Huh.
And it actually worked on me. I always hate these
Ah.
things. But honestly, it was a really interesting concept of, an entire sort of race of people, country of people that have just been imprisoned in this silo underground. They don't know why they're there. Anyway,
Yeah.
so now I've gone down the rabbit hole, quite literally, with this Apple TV show, which I think is pretty well done.
I like that. I've heard good things, and I think there were books first, and then they made it into a
Always
TV
a good
show.
sign, I think. Yeah.
Always a good sign. And they, friend of the show, Trip Fuller from Homebrew Christianity, has talked about this before. I'm seen about it and talked about it, and so that's definitely in the queue for me. I'll share like one thing that Netflix did to me is I did not. We've been watching Cobra Kai all the way through. We thought this was the final season and the final episode. And then when the final episode happened, I said, "How much time is left in this? Because how are they going to wrap this all up in like 5 or 10 minutes?" And then when it ended, it said final episode coming February 13th. And I was like, "What? We got to wait how long?" So they
So
did
fun.
it. I know that's how they get you. One other thing that I'm geeking out on is I just saw the two first episodes of Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, a new Disney Plus cartoon around an animated series with Spider-Man, kind of the Tom Holland MCU universe version of this
Hmm.
Spider-Man, and I really loved it. I love the animation style. John, I don't know if you've watched it or heard it, or if you're a fan of cartoons and animation. You're an illustrator, so I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or if that's something you're going to check out.
Yeah, no, I always love cartoons that are also sort of pushing the envelope formally, meaning like what they formally look like. And I was so taken, like a lot of artists, with the Spider Verse, into the Spider Verse movies, and even that new the reboot of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles
Yes.
movie did some
Mm-hmm.
stuff formally with their animation that I thought was really interesting. So yeah, I love studying that stuff. I'm obviously a fan of everything drawn. So yeah, that's I got to check out that series though.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it's good, good for the whole family. And yeah, I agree. I like the computer generated imagery and the clone Star Wars Clone Wars, that type of animation. But this kind of going back to 2D ish, um, like you're reading a comic book on your TV is
Hmm.
pretty fun. So that's it's kind of in that style. So I highly recommend that. Um, Yeah, so that's what we've been geeking out on. John, share us. Everybody has an origin story. You share C.S. Lewis and Tolkien's origin story and the origin story of their friendship. What is your origin story as a creator?
Well, in some ways, that's why I really wanted to make this book, is because I owe so much of my the validation of my imagination to kind of two streams that were happening at the same time when I was young, and that was Star Wars, the sort of validation of world building, and Star Wars is not science fiction; it's fantasy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Yep.
mythology. So you put that alongside my obsession with The Hobbit, and then later Narnia, and then Dungeons and Dragons, and all these things were really about the not just the stories, but also the imagery inside these works. Just
Mm-hmm.
personally, like I would not have read The Hobbit if it was not lushly illustrated. The copy I had as a kid was illustrated by Michael Haig, and gorgeous Smaug illustration on the cover.
Yep.
Much like Tolkien, I was obsessed with dragons, and anything that had a dragon on it, I was going to read. And so my entry point into the world of making, and of course, when I was a kid, I wasn't thinking like, do I have a theological framework for creativity? I wasn't thinking that. I was just interested in stories. And so then later, as my faith is becoming more real, I'm looking back on that stuff and realizing, wow, there's things that connect the hero's journey, that connect Lewis and Tolkien to why they were making stuff, and the sort of discarded image that Lewis always talks about in his work. So yeah, no, it's a pretty straight line once you look back on it.
That's super cool. So, yeah, I mean, and then what I learned from your book too is that I knew Tolkien was like to draw and do maps and such a creator in his own business, but in terms of like creating the covers, creating the actual drawings and illustrations itself in the book, was something that I learned that I didn't know that he was. I mean, he had time, like you share in the book
No,
of
he was
being.
a true polymath. He could do so many things, and it actually kind of annoys me when people refer to him as an amateur artist, because
Mm,
it was much more than that to him. I mean, he thought of himself that way because he was self conscious about his ability to draw figures and things. But if you
right.
look back at his work, he was really much more of a designer, a graphic artist, as opposed to just a pure illustrator, which is one of the interesting conundrums about his philosophy of fantasy works. He very
Hmm.
famously, and on fairy stories, said the worst thing you can do for fantasy is to illustrate it, because it strips something away from the
Huh.
imaginative mind of the reader. And of
Right.
course, careful observers will realize that Tolkien himself illustrated The Hobbit and many of his other works. So I think the way you square that circle conceptually is that he was really acting more like a designer than a painter.
And that's what I like the format of this book. I mean, of your book. Again, it's the Mythmakers. It is the subtitle is the Remarkable Fellowship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And what you do, and you did it with your book on Bonhoeffer as well, the Faithful Spy, is that there's illustrations, there's thought bubbles. It reads like a graphic novel, and yet there are text and history. So it's a both and of what you've done. You create. I don't know, Penny, there's others out there like this, but you've created a whole different genre of both text and history and dates and outlines, along with kind of graphic novel, illustrated version of telling this story. And so I just love the way you tell this story. And it's narrated, and we follow the path of a lion and a wizard who are guiding us through this story of telling Lewis's and Tolkien's story. And then there are certain portals that you can go through, much like a choose your own adventure. Go to this page if you want to go down this portal, and then come back to the rest of the story, because there's a lot to cover in terms of defining terms and where their place is in the legacy of the genre of just storytelling as a whole. My question for you, and I kind of geek out around this stuff. Like, I would love to hear the origin story of this actual book, but I'm amazed when I talk to creators and comic book artists and creators. Like, how long did it take? I mean, you share in the book that Lewis churned out Narnia pretty quick, but for Lewis, for Tolkien, he did like 10, 20, 30, 50 years of working on things. The idea in your head for this book to when I had it in my hand as a physical copy, how long was that process?
Well, it's about 5 or 6 years if you count
Mm,
it all. I mean, I had longed to write something about them or engage their works for a long time because I just was a fan. And the core concept of this book really was I Lewis and Tolkien subcreated these two worlds that we know very well, Narnia and Middle Earth, and those have been illustrated lushly many, many times. But I kind of argue in the book that they also subcreated this third thing
mm,
that is really their own friendship, right? Like the
right.
Inklings, the smoky pubs with your friends talking poetry and the things of life with a beer, a fire in the fireplace and snow outside. That is such a fantasy. Like it honestly doesn't really exist on some level. Like I'm a professor. I How many times do I read poetry with my fellow professors at the pub? I mean only like 6 or 7 times a week. So no, I mean I'd never, right? Like so my thought with this book is the
Mm,
Inklings, the myth of Lewis and Tolkien has never been illustrated. And
right.
so I put them inside a myth about themselves that has story that of course tells their biography faithfully, but also kind of wraps in this mythological language and
Hmm.
Lion and Wizard do some of that work.
Yeah, I love that. It's almost like the lion, the wizard will often break the fourth wall and look at me as a reader in an audience and say, "Come along, are you still there? Hey, I'm asking
Mhm.
you have a question for us? Well, let's go down this road. Let's look at this journey and adventure together." And I couldn't put the book down. I'm engaged as a reader with them inviting me to part of it. It was meta that way. But one of my biggest takeaways from this book is that the creative process doesn't happen in a vacuum. You don't do it alone. You have your people, you have your team, you have your community, you have your friendships that will challenge you, that will hold you accountable, but also push you and encourage you. And you're like, oh, I don't know if this is really good. What do you think? They're like, this is so good. This should be
Mhm.
out there. Other people should see this other than me.
Yeah.
And so seeing that illustrated about them gathering in the Smoky Pub and around fireplaces and sharing their work together was really inspiring to me because that's I in my churches that I've served, I've always started a God Loves Geeks book club where we, hey, what are you geeking out on? Let's read a comic book, let's read a graphic novel, sci-fi book, or go see a movie and then talk about it after. And I was Marina's like I did not invent that. That was the Inklings. They did that. So
Well, and their friendship started through basically a shared fandom.
mhm,
They met through a love of Norse mythology,
right.
and Lewis joined this reading club that Tolkien had started. He was always making these little clubs with funny names, and this one was called the Coal Biters.
I
And
love that.
they read Norse myths in Icelandic together. And,
Mm,
you can see how it would be like going to a meeting at your job, your corporate job, and somebody's wearing a Wolverine t-shirt or whatever. And you're like, oh my gosh, are you into Wolverine? Basically that's what it was. And
yeah, yeah.
they really, I mean, they were so similar and yet they were also so different on a lot of levels. They kind of should not have been friends, but
Mm.
for this searching for in the book, the searching for the joy that was in these stories and where it came from.
Yeah, and you tell that story so well. Like I know their story on the surface, and of course know their works, but in terms of really getting deep to their friendship and also how they grew apart and some friction there, you don't shy away from that aspect towards the end of their lives. And I don't want to spoil the end of the book, but in terms of their story, what drove them together also kind of helped pull them apart a little bit because of been their dreams and their hopes of creating these stories. Eventually became popular and published, and they had fan mail, and they had C.S. Lewis was on the BBC doing his podcast out there with everybody and getting fame. And so you have things that pull you away, you have things that pull you together as friendships. So sometimes there's some things that can distract you or pull you apart too. You don't shy away from that in the book as well. Have there been, in terms of investigating that or illustrating that and telling that story, have Did you learn anything new? Was there any pushback from those, the IPs of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien?
Yeah, their story is like a triumph. It's a bit of a tragedy. It's in
Mhm.
some ways. I mean, I had people who knew the sort of like, oh, they were friends in Oxford and they were in the Inklings, but did not know the sort of full scope of what their life together was, and got to that point in the book. And I got an email from someone who's like, I had to stop reading. I was so like worried that it was going to ruin what I thought about them. And then
Mm.
they said like, okay, I trusted the author. I finished the book, and I'm glad I did. But and I've told this to people, it's actually a better story because it has this loss at the end. Because
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to get too much in the pulpit here, but like theologically, this world is not our home, and
Mm.
there is
Mm.
not a happy ending here, right? And so their life sort of creates in us this longing for the eternal lasting, a kind of home, a
Mm.
restoration of the things that have been lost in this world. And I have a kind of my cake and eat it too in this book, and that I give them a chance for that. And
Mhm.
Tolkien himself was obsessed with this concept of the eucatastrophe, or the anti-catastrophe, and it's all over his books. And if there's one
Yeah.
criticism of Lord of the Rings, that there's too many of those. It's Gandalf at Helm's Deep and the Eagles, and it's everything. But so I just felt like I could not tell this story without giving them that opportunity to put those losses in their life in some kind of context of what they believed.
Yeah, and I don't know if this was intentional or not. I'm sure it was, but in terms of how you tell the beginning of their story and then right smack dab in the middle of the book, almost to the page, you have C.S. Lewis's conversion to theism and then Christianity, and the myth that was made real, and
Hmm.
and then their growing friendship in terms of how he grew in his faith and the stories that they wanted to tell, and then towards the end, you get towards the end, and yeah, you don't shy away from the fact that community's hard, friendship's hard, people are messy. We do have disagreements. It wasn't a happily ever after fairy tale for them in a sense. There were some real breakdowns and disagreements and disillusionment on many levels. But then there is that hope. They wrote about hope. They wrote about restoration. This longing and aching for that we're a part of a grand story and a redemption story, and you illustrate that so well, and pull it back around. I will say, as I finished reading the book, I had a small little, it was a small little tear in the left corner of
You're
my eye.
not
There's
you're
kind
not alone. You're not
Yep,
alone here.
yep. I was moved. I was
I mean,
moved, and
and
they're
people should know they did not die angry at one another. It was
right.
like the dimming of something that was once rich and bright, and the loss that comes through time and age and conflict. And Tolkien, after Lewis died, wrote in his letters about Lewis in ways that were really stark and
Hmm,
beautiful. Saying that Lewis's loss was like an axe blow at the roots of his life.
hmm,
And so he felt it profoundly, because Lewis's death was somewhat sudden, and Tolkien was not prepared, um, and it really did change what he thought about Lewis, I think.
hmm. It's amazing. Yeah, beautifully told. One thing I want to kind of move to here in a second is, we throw this word myth around. We hear it. We assume what we know, what people mean when they say that word. Even when I'm teaching confirmation and talking to my teens, and I'm talking that Scripture contains myth, they're like, "What? What do you mean? What do you mean by that word?" People get a little gun shy around it. Help us. I mean, really, in this book, you helped illustrate that they create a whole new genre of literature and storytelling when it comes to like the progression and evolution and the process of just telling stories, whether it's from Beowulf to fairy tales to whatever Chaucer. They created a whole new genre. But in terms of defining myth, how would you define it and help us understand, not seen as just, oh, it's just a fable or a parable that's not true?
Yeah, I think that's
Help us.
generally where people get upset, is they think myth is another word for lie.
Mhm.
And in fact, this is where Lewis makes the same error before he becomes a Christian is he believes that all the stories he read as a kid are ultimately worthless because they're lies. And that should
Mm,
we not, as people of logic and reason and science, care only for things that are true? And Tolkien corrects him, rightly so, and says, no, myths are not
mm,
lies.
mm,
In the same way that you would say, maybe this is a better way to explain it, um, that all fact contains truth, but not all truth contains fact. And one
mm,
area you can think about that in is just poetry, right? Poetry
mhm,
is not necessarily describing facts, but it's describing truth. And there is poetry all over the Bible, right? So the Bible contains myth, basically. And those myths are pointing at something that is you can't get at in any other way, right? I think this is
yeah.
Tolkien's point, is that the things that the myths reveal or poetry reveals, that these are inaccessible without this form. And so it's why Tolkien thought that mythology and fairy tale and fantasy was the highest form of human art, because it
Mm.
was like speaking God's secret Elvish. And the thing that won Lewis over was Tolkien was saying all those myths you love, like Balder and the ancient stories that made sense to you, but somehow in Christianity you were like, I don't know, it doesn't, I don't get it there. The reason those myths existed in his mind was that so humanity could be prepared. We would love the
Mm.
great story of the myth, and then when it came true, we would see it and recognize it and be like, there it is. There's
That's
that
helpful.
thing I loved. There is the story of Iron Man or Luke Skywalker or Harry Potter or whatever myth you want to throw in there.
Mm-mm.
The story, it's honestly, when people ask me why I'm a Christian, I always say some version of, it's just such a great story. Like,
Yeah.
it is so good. I just, the roots of the idea of God becoming man, giving up power to become weak. It's, I
Mm.
mean, that's the whole text of Lord of the Rings, is that weakness defeats power at the moment when it did not expect it, right? So, I mean,
Mm.
all the criticism about Narnia being too literal, don't give me that. Lord of the Rings is way more gospel infused than anything in Narnia. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean that's just my personal hot take, but yeah,
Yeah, I agree, and it's one of those things where we are. I believe that creating the image of God doesn't mean that God has two eyes, a nose, and a bald head like me. But in terms of this kind of co-creator imagination, creativity that can reflect on that and draw meaning from it and process that with the community that I'm a part of, is what makes me human and in the image of the Creator who created me, who wrote me into this ongoing story of redemption. And there's definitely like, sorry, my lights just went out just a second. There you go. There is, and you don't shy away from the fact that their story, in terms of disillusionment from, there was this idea and myth of human progress that ends up bumping up against the First World War and seeing just horrible things. And so, of course, you'd be like, I'm disillusioned. I don't know if I want to be a part of this story. If this is the human story, I don't want anything to do with it. How could God allow this thing to happen? But what I love about C.S. Lewis's story and that you illustrate in here, that it's the community of the Inklings and his friendships with really smart people who
yeah,
also happen to be people of faith. So it's not just like, oh, you're ignorant, you're dumb, you're believing in fairy tales because you just use it as a crutch. He grew up, he created a relationship community with people. He knew them inside and out and knew that they were smart, authentic, trusting people who also happen to be people of faith. So
mhm,
he was able to trust that and lean into that and entertain those thoughts along with it. And so, I have members of my church who are uh, very accomplished scientists and researchers. And so if you do that stereotype that, well, like science and faith don't mix, you're like, well, I have some really smart scientists who also happen to be people of faith, and they're really smart, and they still understand this longing for joy and hope and story. So, um, yeah, yeah,
well,
really, really,
you could argue, like, there's a big question of why did Lord of the Rings and Narnia take off when it did? Because people had been writing adult fantasy for 50 years ahead of them. Edison, Lord Dunsany, I mean, William Morris, George MacDonald, all had written adult fantasy that did not capture the public imagination. And I think partially the reason why it took off when it did, like you said, after World War I and World War II, the world had been disenchanted basically. And I just kind of think humanity was ready to be put under a spell again. And I mean, you can make a very clear argument. Actually, I talk about it at the end of the book. Is that Star Trek and Lord of the Rings basically invented fan culture in the West.
Right.
And the idea of not just I like that story, but that story I identify with it. Like
Yeah.
there is something about it that I have placed inside my own personal identity. I mean, Tolkien himself didn't really understand it. He got letters from people talking about Hobbit parties and cooking the food and dressing up. And frankly, he thought that was strange because that's not what it meant for him to identify with a story. But yeah, you can draw a straight line from that to San Diego Comic-Con.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the same way that Star Wars hit in 1977 in terms of, hitting the right time and geopolitics and looking for hope and what the movies were doing at the time. Lucas had a great story, but that in terms of where it hit at the time in history and what people were hungering for and longing for is exactly right. Share a little bit more about like them creating this whole new genre. I mean, I think they kind of patchwork some things together and pulled some things that they love, but they also, you tell in there that they had almost like a bet. Like at one Inklings meeting, they flipped a coin to challenge each other's like Mary Shelley did with Frankenstein of like, hey, I challenge you, go on a writing retreat. Let's see what we bring back and talk about it. But through this, they created a whole new genre that emerged, or a whole new on the world tree, a new branch that bare new fruit. What
That's right. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, it's in some ways they started on the same adventure and then crossed paths. Like, Tolkien had just written The Hobbit for kids, and Lewis and Tolkien were at Eagle and Child and flipped a coin, and heads you get space travel, tails you get time travel. And Lewis got space travel and wrote the space trilogy. I mean, published instantly. It's driving Tolkien nuts. Tolkien wrote The Lost Road because he got the time travel one, and it ended up going nowhere. He hated it. He revised it a bazillion times. It turned into the Numenor myth, and so he did get something out of it. But yes, their desires to sort of write something that they loved that was good and took an adult audience seriously. They both did that, and then Tolkien moved into Lord of the Rings and had a temptation to actually rewrite The Hobbit. When he got stuck on Lord of the Rings, he wanted to rewrite The Hobbit so that it would be older and fit the tone of Lord of the Rings. And then Lewis went the other direction and started writing fantasy for young minds. And Lewis, to this, in all of his letters, he never really explains why he decided to do that, other than he was an extremely intuitive writer and maker. And, Tolkien famously did not like Narnia. And I think part of it was feeling a little betrayed on their project together. And also, I mean, you have to put it in context. Tolkien didn't like anything, like literally
right.
anything. He read Dune, hated it, read everything. It was not good enough because he was just a very persnickety, he had some curmudgeon-y sensibility issues. So it's not a shock that he hated Narnia. I mean, it is shocking because Lewis was shocked because he was not prepared for his closest ally in art making to just dismiss it out of hand. But fortunately it was saved by R.L. Green from probably being binned. The first 3 chapters Lewis wrote, in a couple weeks. And, he wrote 7 Narnia books in 7 years. So he was an extremely prolific writer, rarely did major revisions, just kind of got it on the first try.
Damn it. Dang it.
Check, check. I hear you.
Sorry, internet troubles.
No, it happens to the best of us.
It sure does. Dang it. But I think we're still recording, so there's a little break there in YouTube land, maybe for folks, or even Joshua having to edit this for the
I
podcast.
should have
But
just
you were
done a
on a
reading. I should have just opened the book and started reading and just
That's
my own
right. That's right. Just pick a page, random page, and start reading. But I think what you were just saying, where we're kind of, I know I was cut off on my end about just in terms of them flipping this coin, going crossing paths, and then their creative process, and the Tolkien being kind of a curmudgeon around Narnia, and Lewis making a conscious decision to target children. But I think what I picked up in your book is that there was kind of a lost childhood for both of them.
Mm-hmm.
And C.S. Lewis, when he encountered Joy and her kids, and the Second World War and children being displaced because of bombings, there was this connection to children, a childlike wonder of trying to get back. Him and his brother were trying to get back to their childhood home and the library, and pretending and living out and writing stories. So for him
Well,
to
that's you talked about things that I didn't know coming into the book, and that
yeah,
was one that I remember reading and being shocked that I did not know, is that Lewis had kids from the Blitz stay at the kilns,
right,
and that was, of course, partially what inspired the four kids in the Narnia stories.
yeah,
And yeah, I mean, he announced to his brother that he was writing a book for children, and they were like, "That's ridiculous. You don't have children. Why would you do this?" So yes, in
hmm,
many ways, like a lot of the choices in his career were really strange looking back. Like we look back at them as if they were inspired because it was successful. But I mean, the same thing with Tolkien. Like I personally think that if he had not met Lewis, um, I think you might have a sort of footnote about
mm,
Tolkien and what he made. Like,
yeah,
it would be like world famous philologist dies, and in his closet is a 10,000 page manuscript about a made up world. What a weird thing. Like I think he needed
yeah,
someone to help encourage him. He was such a noodler and a procrastinator. If you've ever read his story, Leaf by Niggle, it's this allegorical
yeah.
tale. It's like a confession of a perfectionist, and it's a wonderful story.
Ah, I love that. Yeah, it's one of those things of like these stories we love, but for both of them, we probably would not have them without their friendship with one another. And I think I took that away. I knew that, but you illustrated it for me in a deeper way that I loved experiencing through your book. All right, a couple more questions. I want to. So, is there a question you wished? I know you've been on tour, you've been promoting the book. It's fantastic. I can't recommend it enough. But is there a question out there you wish people would ask you about this book or your process or what you learned in it?
Oh yeah, whenever I do these things, I really want to talk about like the color palette, or the technical stuff that comes from sitting with making art for so long. There's just so many
Mm-hmm.
individual choices you
Mm-hmm.
have to make in a book, and like, the colors were a fun one. Like it depends on your level of attentiveness. The colors slowly dim throughout the book. It looks
Yeah.
like it's printed in these sort of four color process colors, like Pantone colors, but it's not. It's printed CMYK so that I could do this trick of dimming all the colors as their friendship dims.
Ah,
And then it sort of comes back to life at the end. And then there's this new color that comes in that's not anywhere else in the book at the very end. And so it's things like that that I really I really like. And also, you know, the sort of metaphor of using lion and wizard and the fact that they're in a book. You know, I have had some people ask me like, is this, are they in purgatory like in this book? And
Mm.
really interesting, right? I mean, it's kind of a thing I thought about as I was making it. You know, I don't, that's not a theological concept I believe in, but like the idea that they are in a holding room together to sort out their life, and this book is part of that. I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah, I love that. Like I'm a huge comic book fan. I have my weekly pull at my comic shop, and whenever people are talking about books, most of the time they'll talk about the author and an artist, but you know, yeah, the colorist has just as
Yeah,
much
that's right.
impact on
Yeah,
that. The letterer, what fonts you use, where you put the thought bubbles, where you put them, the conversation, so it doesn't impact the actual art and the pages you're illustrating for folks. That kind of dynamic storytelling, I believe, in terms of how I like to consume my stories when it comes to sequential art and words connected to it, is
yeah.
amazing. So
And
yeah, I
that's the
love that
funny thing about
that
when
creative
you're
process.
an illustrator, author, artist, you're like, it's a one-man band. It's like you are making a film and you
Mm.
do every role. You're the cinematographer, the costume designer, the script writer, the lighter, the like every single thing is you. It's extremely stressful
Mm.
because sometimes you just feel like maybe someone else should be able to help me with this, you know?
My friend Lee, you listening? Yeah, yeah, we're gonna do that Kickstarter for your story idea. I hear that. The creative process takes a long time. You got
Oh,
this.
right.
Yeah, I love that. I can get the minutia of that all day too. All right, here, final question I want to ask you. All right, if you only had to choose one book from C.S. Lewis and Tolkien on a deserted island, secluded island, you're there for years, you're on the TV show alone, and you only have a couple things with you, and you can take one book. Which one out of their pantheon of stories are you going to take?
Oh man, it's such a good question. I mean, I've read Screwtape Letters a
It's
ton.
hard.
I've read, I just reread Mere Christianity because I was leading a class on it at my church. I think probably it would be Fellowship. There's just something about the beginning of that story. It's like there's something happens every fall. The
Yeah.
weather changes. It just dips below 50 degrees, and I'm like, okay, time to put the scarf on and read Fellowship. You know, so it'd probably be that just for the sort of aura of jumping into that world, and the beginnings of stories are so good.
Yeah, I love that. And when I was thinking about this question for myself, I kind of boiled down to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and The Hobbit, just because that they meant so much to me when I was younger, and then rereading them, and they are like kind of a beginning to end contained, self-contained story in of them themselves. But I think in this season of my life where I am, I do think I'd probably take The Hobbit with me at this point. Asking me
Yeah.
today, I would take The Hobbit with me
Well,
and sit with it
I've
for a
told
long
my
time
family they
and do
need to
that. But
read. I've told my family they need to read. Yeah, I might amend my list to put Dawn Treader on there because the scene where Reepicheep goes over the
ah,
wave into like Aslan's land. Oh, I said that's got to be read at my funeral. I love it.
oh yeah, and the when he becomes a dragon and they're ripping the scales off him, becoming a new creation,
Oh yeah,
becoming a
yeah,
new person. That's such rich with baptismal imagery of the old self dying, the new self. I was just like, oh, that scene had very big impact on me too. Last battle, yeah, it's hard to pick. They're all great, but yeah, I think The Hobbit right now. In fact, I'm a blow the dust off that one and maybe read it again
yeah.
pretty
That's right.
pretty soon. Yeah. Well, John, really appreciate you joining us today on Systematic Ecology and talking about this book. I can't recommend it enough. People go out, get the Mythmakers, consume it, sit with it for a while, get tea or a pint to sit by a fire, get your scarf, and then think about and reflect on there it is right there. I took the jacket off mine, so I was like, oh, should I show it? But man, look at
Yeah.
me,
Oh
joy,
yeah. It looks
joy.
great without the jacket.
Um, yeah, and I also recommend the Faithful Spy. Uh, uh, the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and illustrated the same way, told the same way. But in terms of, I think we're living in a Bonhoeffer moment in our own geopolitical world. And I would definitely recommend that one in terms of understanding the story of Bonhoeffer and what he was wrestling with and the impact he had on the world too. So, John, other things you would like to recommend? Is there a project you're working on next? Is there a book that's there in your head?
Yeah,
ready to go?
I got one
What's
on the
next?
table. I got one on the table right now. It's a follow-up to my book, Drawing is Magic. So that's learning to generate ideas in a sketchbook. So I've got a sequel to that that's coming out next year called The 100 Things List. And then my next sort of long form graphic novel, which I'm in the reading and writing stage right now, is a retelling of the Salem witch trials. And I've always been fascinated with that story, and it's actually way scarier and weirder than you. Everyone thinks they know that story because they've read The Crucible or Scarlet Letter, but like it is wild, and I can't wait to have you read that book.
Oh, I can't either, man. Writing that on a sticky note and put it on the inside of the Mythmakers to make sure
Okay,
I keep
look for that in
for
15 years. Yeah.
There you go. Yep. Take your time. I trust you. Thanks, folks. Like, share, review the show. Tell your friends about us. Share with a friend. Share with an enemy. And go out and get Mythmakers. John, appreciate it. And we'll be following your work. Proud of what you're doing. And keep geeking out.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Got it.